I'm Edward, and it's always a pleasure to spend this quiet time with you. If you're a fan of these cozy mysteries, you can now enjoy them on Spotify. The link is in the description below. Now let the story unfold. Chapter 1. Cakes in the Willow Corner Window. The last days of August had settled over St Mary Mead with the particular gentleness of a season that knows it is ending. The mornings arrived with a faint coolness that had not been present in July, and by afternoon the light had taken on that warm, amber quality which makes even the most familiar stretches of English countryside appear slightly more beautiful than one had previously noticed. Gardens were at their fullest. The roses along the cottage walls had passed their first flush but continued bravely, and the kitchen gardens gave off that pleasant heavy scent of ripening fruit and well-turned earth that belongs exclusively to late summer. It was into this unhurried scene that Miss Jane Marple walked one Tuesday afternoon, following the gently sloping lane that led from her cottage toward the centre of the village. She carried a small basket over one arm, as she generally did, though the contents were of no particular consequence. What mattered was the walk itself, and the things one observed along the way. Miss Marple had always believed that a village lane, properly attended to, was among the most informative places in the world. Her destination that afternoon was the Willow Corner Tea Room, which occupied a former cottage at the near end of the High Street, its low windows framed by a climbing rose that had been trained up the stone facade with evident care. It was one of the small pleasures of St Mary Mead, and Miss Marple was not alone in her appreciation of it. On market days especially, the little tables within were reliably occupied, and even on quieter afternoons there was generally someone to be found nursing a pot of tea over a newspaper or a piece of correspondence. The establishment had been opened 7 years prior by Mrs. Eleanor Finch, a widow who had come to the village following the death of her husband, a solicitor from a town some distance to the north. She had arrived with modest means, a competent manner, and what appeared to be a genuine talent for making people comfortable. The tea-room had prospered, not spectacularly, but steadily, in the manner of ventures that are run with honest attention rather than ambition. Mrs. Finch herself was a woman of perhaps 55, with dark hair only beginning to silver at the temples, and a face that was pleasant without being remarkable. She had the particular quality of making one feel welcome without any apparent effort, asking after one's family and recalling small details of previous conversations in a way that suggested she truly listened. She wore habitually a dark skirt and a cream-coloured blouse beneath a cotton apron embroidered in pale blue at the hem. Miss Marple had always thought her a very capable sort of woman, the kind who would manage any difficulty quietly and without fuss. Assisting her at the counter most afternoons was Mrs. Harriet Cole, a rounder, more cheerfully talkative woman of 40 or so, whose husband worked at the grain merchants on the other side of the village. Mrs. Cole was one of those persons who give the impression of constant mild animation, her hands always occupied with something, and her conversation running comfortably without requiring too much of its audience. She was fond of Mrs. Finch, that much was clear, though she was equally fond of news and of passing it along, and it was generally understood that any confidence shared at the Willow Corner counter would be circulated with kindly intentions but modest discretion. Miss Marple pushed open the low door with its small brass bell, and the familiar scents of warm cake and Ceylon tea reached her at once. The afternoon was still young enough that 2 of the 4 tables were occupied. At the table nearest the window sat Mr. Thomas Garner, a retired railway clerk who had lived alone at the far end of Orchard Row since the death of his wife some years before. He was a spare, rather angular man in his late 60s, with reading spectacles pushed up onto his forehead and a half-completed crossword puzzle spread open before him beside an untouched pot of tea. Mr. Garner was a quiet, methodical person, the sort who arrives and departs at regular hours and whose presence in an establishment is felt less as a personality than as a reliable feature of the furniture. He acknowledged Miss Marple's entrance with a small nod over his spectacles. At the table by the back garden window, a little apart from the others, sat Miss Lydia Brooke, the village dressmaker, whose workroom occupied the upper floor of a narrow house 3 doors down from the post office. Miss Brooke was a slender woman of perhaps 45, precise in her movements and careful in her dress, with an observant grey eye that was accustomed to noticing the way things were put together. She earned her living by paying close attention to how fabric behaved and where seams strained, and this habit of attention had extended, as such habits often do, into the rest of her daily life. She was not unkind, but she was exact, and exactness in a village can sometimes be mistaken for severity. She was reading a letter when Miss Marple entered and did not look up immediately, though Miss Marple suspected she was aware of the arrival. Mrs. Cole appeared at once from behind the counter with a warm greeting and a suggestion of the Victoria sponge, which was particularly good that afternoon, she said, as Mrs. Finch had made a fresh one before the luncheon hour. Miss Marple settled at her usual table, the small one near the fireplace, and ordered her tea and a modest slice of sponge, and then occupied herself for some time in the manner she most enjoyed, which was to observe and to think, while appearing to do no more than admire the roses in the garden through the glass. It was a Tuesday, which meant Mr. Bernard Hale was likely to appear before the afternoon was out. He was a travelling salesman, a man in his middle 40s who represented a small firm of household goods suppliers, and whose route brought him through St. Mary Mead most weeks on market day, or the day following. He was a pleasant enough presence at the tea-room, broad-shouldered and somewhat florid in complexion, with the particular social ease that belongs to men who spend their working days persuading strangers. He had been coming to the Willow Corner for several years and was on friendly familiar terms with Mrs. Finch, in the way of a valued regular customer. He arrived at 3:30, removing his hat at the door and addressing Mrs. Cole with his customary brightness. Miss Marple, who had by now been served her tea and was engaged in a gentle examination of the sponge cake, observed that Mr. Hale's manner was somewhat less easy than usual. He smiled and spoke as he always did, but there was something behind the smile that was working rather hard to remain invisible. He glanced toward the kitchen door once before sitting down, and when Mrs. Finch herself appeared a few minutes later carrying a fresh pot of hot water, Miss Marple noticed the brief exchange of looks between them. It was not unfriendly, but it was not quite comfortable either. Miss Marple sipped her tea and said nothing, and thought rather a great deal. The afternoon passed in its pleasant, unhurried way. Mr. Garner completed another line of his crossword and refilled his own cup with the absent-minded competence of long practice. Miss Brooke finished her letter and folded it away with care. Mr. Hale finished his tea, paid at the counter, and departed with his hat back on and his briefcase under his arm, pausing at the door to say something to Mrs. Cole that made her laugh. And Miss Marple, walking home in the long amber light of the late afternoon, remarked to herself that the Willow Corner was as comfortable as ever, and that comfort, in her experience, was very frequently the condition under which the most inconvenient things quietly arranged themselves. She was therefore not entirely surprised, though she was genuinely sorry, when Dolly Bantry telephoned her the following morning with the news that Mrs. Eleanor Finch had been found dead beside the door to the back garden, and that the circumstances surrounding her passing were not, as Inspector Slack had been heard to remark, altogether straightforward. Miss Marple stood for a moment with the telephone receiver in her hand after the call was concluded, looking out at her own garden in the morning light. Places devoted to comfort, she said to herself quietly, sometimes conceal the most uncomfortable truths. She set down the receiver, picked up her knitting from the arm of the chair, and sat down to think. Chapter 2. A closed sign on the tea-room door. The morning after an unexpected death has a quality all its own in a small village. It is not merely that the news travels quickly, though it does, passing from gate to gate and across garden walls with a speed that would surprise anyone who believed the countryside to be slow. It is, rather, that the news settles differently upon each person it reaches, and that one can read a great deal in the way a face receives it. Some people grow immediately practical, offering kettles and assistance. Others retreat into a kind of solemn quiet, as though silence were a form of respect. And a few, a very few, become almost imperceptibly watchful, their ordinary expressions arranged with just a fraction more care than usual. Miss Marple had lived long enough in St. Mary Mead to observe all 3 varieties before 9 o'clock on the Wednesday morning. She'd gone out early, as was her habit, to cut a few stems from the sweet peas along the garden wall, and had found that the lane was already possessed of a certain subdued animation. Mrs. Hartley from the cottages near the church had stopped to speak to the postman at the corner. 2 women whose names Miss Marple did not know were talking earnestly outside the draper's, and old Mr. Piggott, who walked his retriever each morning at the same hour regardless of weather or circumstance, had paused on his usual route and was standing quite still at the far end of the lane with a look of genuine bewilderment upon his weathered face. It was Dolly Bantry who had telephoned the previous evening to say that Mrs. Finch had been discovered, and it was Dolly who appeared at Miss Marple's gate before 8:30, with a warm expression of concern and that particular eagerness which she had never quite managed to separate from the interest she took in unusual events. The doctor was there until quite late, she said, accepting Miss Marple's offer of coffee with no hesitation. Colonel Bantry spoke to Inspector Slack this morning. You know how the inspector will ring him whenever there is anything remotely out of the ordinary, though he gives the impression of finding it a nuisance. The inspector seems to think it may have been a fall. The back garden door, apparently. Yes, said Miss Marple, and said nothing further for a moment, which was a habit of hers that Dolly had long since learned to wait out. The tea-room itself remained closed when Miss Marple made her way along the High Street shortly before 10. The sign in the window, a neat card lettered in Mrs. Finch's own hand, read simply, "Closed," and had been turned to face the glass with the same careful attention to appearance that had characterized the establishment in all its years of operation. It was, Miss Marple thought, rather a melancholy little detail. The roses on the facade continued their quiet blooming regardless, as roses will. Inspector Slack was present, as he so often was in circumstances of this kind, present in body and manner but somewhat limited, in Miss Marple's private estimation, in the more essential capacities. He was a lean man of 50, with a habit of standing with his hands in his pockets, and speaking with the air of one who had already formed a conclusion, and required only the remainder of the evidence to confirm it. He was not unkind, and he was not without competence, but he belonged to that class of investigator who regards the smallest details as beneath notice, and is consequently surprised rather often. He had interviewed Mrs. Harriet Cole that morning, beginning early, and Mrs. Cole was sitting now in the small room behind the tea-room counter, what Mrs. Finch had always called the back office, though it contained little more than a writing desk, a shelf of receipts, and a chair, with a cup of tea she had made for herself and an expression that mingled genuine grief with the mild shock of one who had spent the previous evening answering questions. Miss Marple, who had been permitted entry by the inspector with only minimal reluctance, sat across from Mrs. Cole and listened. "She was perfectly well when I left," Mrs. Cole said, for what was evidently not the first time that morning. "We had finished the clearing together, as we always did, and I collected my coat and my bag from the peg by the kitchen and said good evening. She was standing at the counter, I distinctly remember, because she was wiping down the sugar tray, which she always did last of anything. She waved her cloth at me and said she would see me Thursday." "And the back garden door," said Miss Marple gently. "Or was it bolted when you left?" Mrs. Cole hesitated, and in the hesitation Miss Marple observed something that was not quite uncertainty, but rather the mild discomfort of a person being asked to state plainly what they had, until that moment, only half articulated to themselves. "I assumed so," she said at last. "It was always bolted. Mrs. Finch was most particular about it. She said once that the garden backed onto the footpath, and that there was no reason for that door to be anything but bolted after closing time. It was one of those habits of hers that she kept so faithfully you simply stopped noticing it." "Quite so," said Miss Marple, "and yet it was found ajar." Mrs. Cole nodded, her expression troubled. "That is what I cannot account for." Inspector Slack, who had reappeared in the doorway in time to hear the last exchange, he said with the comfortable authority of a man restating what he considered settled, that there was no particular mystery in an unlocked door, since Mrs. Finch might perfectly well have opened it herself for any number of ordinary reasons, air, or a delivery, or a moment in the garden, and that what the evidence suggested was a woman in her middle years who had suffered a sudden physical episode near the rear entrance and had been unfortunate enough to fall against the stone threshold. The doctor had indicated that a blow to the head of such a kind could produce unconsciousness and subsequent death without any great outward sign of disturbance. Miss Marple listened to all of this with the expression of mild, courteous attention she employed when she did not wish to argue, but had not in any degree been persuaded. Mr. Thomas Garner had given his account that morning as well. He had been, he said, the last customer to depart before closing, leaving at roughly 20 minutes to 6, as was his regular practice on Tuesdays. He had seen nothing unusual. Mrs. Finch had been at the counter with Mrs. Cole, both of them going about the end-of-day business in the ordinary way. The tea-room had appeared entirely normal. He had walked home by the lane as always, and had heard nothing to cause him any concern. Miss Brooke had been spoken to briefly, having arrived at the tea-room on Wednesday morning on her customary route past the High Street, and found the closed sign already in place. She'd confirmed that she'd been among the afternoon's customers the previous day, and had departed around 4:30. She mentioned, in the careful and precise manner that characterised her speech, that she'd remained in her workroom until well into the evening, and had heard the garden gate, the low wooden gate at the end of the footpath that ran along the back of the tea-room property, close with its familiar click at some point after dusk. She had thought nothing of it at the time, assuming it to be a neighbour. Miss Marple walked home slowly, taking the longer way by the church path, and considered the various threads laid out before her, with the attentiveness of a person sorting a complicated piece of embroidery. An unbolted door that was always bolted, a garden gate heard closing after dark, a woman known for her habitual tidiness found in circumstances that did not quite accord with those habits, and an inspector prepared to settle upon the most available explanation with what Miss Marple felt was somewhat premature confidence. She paused at the lich gate and looked back along the lane toward the tea-room, its closed sign just visible in the distance. People who keep tidy establishments, she said to herself quietly, rarely forget their own habits. She adjusted her basket on her arm and continued home to her knitting and her thoughts, which were, as was often the case, rather more active than they appeared. Chapter 3. The Empty Table by the Back Garden. By Thursday morning the village had settled into that secondary phase of collective feeling, which follows the first shock of unexpected news. The initial flurry of exchange, the urgent conversations at gates, the telephone calls made on impulse, had given way to something quieter and more considered. People still spoke of Mrs. Finch, but they did so now with the measured gravity of those who have had a night's sleep in which to arrange their thoughts, and the arrangements, Miss Marple reflected, were not always tidier for the interval. She had spent Wednesday evening with her knitting and a certain amount of careful reflection, pausing occasionally to note down in the small notebook she kept for such purposes a phrase or observation that seemed worth preserving. She had also, somewhat to her own mild amusement, found herself reviewing everything she knew of Mrs. Finch, not as the pleasant proprietress of a comfortable establishment, but as a person, her habits, her character, her relationships within the village, and the small frictions and accommodations that make up the texture of any life lived in proximity to others. Mrs. Finch had been, by all observable evidence, a woman of settled and orderly disposition. She ran the tea-room on fixed principles, regular hours, reliable quality, a consistent welcome. She remembered her customers' preferences. She kept her accounts carefully. She did not, as far as Miss Marple had ever observed, invite confidences that she did not intend to keep, nor did she encourage the sort of easy intimacy that leads to misunderstanding. She was warm without being effusive, which is a rather more difficult balance to maintain than it sounds, and yet warmth and order, taken together, do not preclude difficulty. They may in fact create it, when the orderly person becomes privy to something that disrupts the careful arrangement they have constructed around themselves. Miss Marple set down her notebook and reached for her knitting. It was on Thursday afternoon that she returned to the tea-room, which Inspector Slack had now consented to allow open for a limited period on the grounds that there was no evident reason to maintain the closure, and that Mrs. Cole had expressed a strong wish to keep the rooms aired and the routine as undisturbed as possible in the circumstances. Miss Marple thought this a sensible instinct on Mrs. Cole's part, whatever the inspector's reasons for permitting it. The atmosphere within was subdued but not oppressive. Mrs. Cole had placed a small arrangement of late summer flowers on the counter, white dahlias and a few pale stems of something Miss Marple did not immediately identify, and the effect was thoughtful rather than showy. The tables had been set as usual, with their white cloths and their small china sugar bowls, and the smell of fresh baking drifted from the kitchen in the reassuring way it always had. Miss Marple appreciated the effort this represented. Grief that continues to put the kettle on has a particular kind of dignity. 2 of the tables were occupied by women Miss Marple recognised from the village, speaking together in lowered voices with the slightly conscientious expressions of people who are discussing something they find troubling, but cannot quite bring themselves to leave alone. Miss Marple ordered tea from Mrs. Cole, and asked, with the simplicity that served her so well, whether she might sit at the table near the garden window. It was the table that had not been properly cleared on the evening of Mrs. Finch's death. Mrs. Cole brought her tea and set it down without comment, but Miss Marple observed that her gaze moved briefly to the table surface before she returned to the counter, in the involuntary way one's eyes return to a place that has acquired significance. The table was, of course, quite clean now. Whatever had been left upon it on Tuesday evening had long since been removed and the cloth changed. But the table's position told its own small story for anyone disposed to read it. It stood slightly apart from the others, angled toward the door that opened onto the back garden, and from it one had a clear view of both the garden path and the kitchen entrance. A person seated here would be visible from the kitchen. A person standing at the garden door, by contrast, would not see this table at all, unless they turned quite deliberately to look. When Mrs. Cole returned to refill the pot, Miss Marple asked her about the plate that had been found there. Mrs. Cole settled into the chair across from her with the air of someone who had been waiting, not impatiently, for the question to be asked. It was one of the smaller cake plates, she said, the ones we use for a single slice. It had a fork on it and a few crumbs, and a napkin that had been folded rather than left flat, which is what people do when they have finished and are in some slight hurry to be off. And you could not account for it, said Miss Marple. Not precisely. I thought at the time that someone had come in late. It does happen. Occasionally someone will slip in just before closing and we would not turn them away. But I could not remember a late customer that Tuesday. And I was quite certain I had cleared all the tables myself before Mrs. Finch and I had our end-of-day conversation by the counter. So the plate appeared after you had cleared. Mrs. Cole looked at her steadily. That is what I have come to think, yes, though I could not swear to it. I might have missed it. But I am fairly careful about such things. Miss Marple nodded and looked out at the garden through the glass. It was a neat, modest little garden, a flagged path, a wooden bench against the far wall, a bed of lavender that had mostly finished, and the wooden gate at the rear that opened onto the public footpath running behind the terrace of buildings. The gate was latched now, its iron latch dull in the overcast light. On Tuesday evening, according to Miss Brooke, that gate had been heard to close some time after dusk. Miss Brooke, said Miss Marple, pursuing the thought aloud in the gentle conversational manner she found useful, mentioned hearing the gate from her workroom. Lydia Brooke notices a great deal, said Mrs. Cole, with the faint touch of reserve that often accompanies acknowledgment of another person's observational gifts. Her window looks out that way, of course. She would hear it easily enough. Yes, said Miss Marple, though one wonders what brought anyone to the garden after the tea-room had closed. The question was not directed at Mrs. Cole in particular, and Mrs. Cole, who was a perceptive woman in her own right, did not attempt to answer it as though it were. She simply looked at the garden herself for a moment, with an expression that suggested she had been asking herself the same thing rather more privately. Miss Marple finished her tea at an unhurried pace, and took her time with the small, neat slice of lemon cake that Mrs. Cole had brought unbidden, apparently from a conviction that the occasion called for it. The two women at the other table had departed, leaving the room pleasantly quiet. A sparrow made a brief investigation of the garden path and departed again, apparently finding nothing of interest. On her way out, Miss Marple paused at the counter and said, in the mildest possible tone, that she hoped Mrs. Cole was resting as well as could be expected. "Well enough," said Mrs. Cole. "I keep thinking about small things. Whether she had had her supper, whether the kitchen light was left on, silly things." "Not silly at all," said Miss Marple with some warmth. "It is precisely the small things that tell us most about a person. Mrs. Finch was someone who attended to them, which is why their absence is so noticeable now. She said good afternoon and went out into the grey mild air of the Thursday afternoon, walking slowly and observing, as she always did, the details of the street around her. The closed sign was gone from the window, replaced by nothing at all, just the clean glass and the white tablecloths visible within, and the small card in the corner that gave the hours of opening, written in Mrs. Finch's careful hand. Whoever had sat at that table by the garden on Tuesday evening had done so after the room had been cleared, and whoever had passed through the garden gate after dark had either left that way or arrived by it. Miss Marple thought these two observations not entirely unrelated. She turned toward home, her basket on her arm, the sweet autumnal air carrying with it the distant smell of someone's bonfire, and the first faint suggestion of the evening chill to come. Chapter 4. Sugar Bowl, Left Untouched. There is a particular kind of Friday morning in late August that belongs almost entirely to itself. The week has done most of its work and knows it, and the atmosphere takes on a faintly reflective quality, as though the hours between breakfast and luncheon are content simply to exist, without requiring anything very urgent from the people moving through them. The High Street of St. Mary Mead expressed this feeling in its customary way. The baker's open, the post office unhurried, 2 or 3 persons nodding to one another outside the chemist's, with the comfortable familiarity of people who have been nodding to one another in the same spot for 20 years, and see no reason to alter the arrangement. Miss Marple had slept thoughtfully, which was her way of describing those nights when the mind continues its quiet business after the eyes have closed, presenting half-formed observations for review like a secretary tidying a desk after hours. She had woken with 2 things clear in her mind. The first was that she wished very much to speak with Miss Lydia Brooke. The second was that she would benefit from another careful look at the tea-room itself, specifically the table by the garden door, in daylight, and without the gentle distraction of Mrs. Cole's company. She achieved the second of these before 10:30, arriving at the Willow Corner at a few minutes past opening time, when Mrs. Cole was still engaged in the kitchen, and the rooms were empty of other customers. She asked for nothing immediately, explaining that she was a little early and would wait comfortably. And Mrs. Cole, whose attention was occupied with something involving a quantity of pastry and an oven that was, by the sound of it, behaving without full cooperation, left her to settle herself without ceremony. Miss Marple did not sit down at once. Instead, she moved through the room in the unhurried manner of a person who is simply finding her bearings, pausing at one table and then another, touching nothing, observing everything. The sugar bowls had all been freshly filled. They sat on their small china saucers at the centre of each table, each one level and neatly arranged. This was proper and correct, and entirely in keeping with Mrs. Finch's standards, now maintained by Mrs. Cole in her absence. Miss Marple examined them without any expression of particular interest. Then she moved to the table by the garden door. The sugar bowl here was identical to the others in form, a small round vessel in the same pale cream china, with a fine blue rim that matched the cups. But when Miss Marple looked at it with the attention it deserved, she saw at once what she'd noticed only in passing on her previous visit. The bowl was half empty, where all the others were full. She stood quite still and considered this for a moment. Mrs. Finch's habit in the matter of sugar bowls had been, according to Mrs. Cole's account, entirely consistent. Each evening before closing, the bowls were checked and refilled as necessary, so that they would be ready for the following morning without requiring additional attention at the start of what was generally a busy period before luncheon. It was the sort of small domestic economy that a woman managing a tea room alone would naturally establish. One less thing to think about in the morning rush. The bowl at this table was half empty. If Mrs. Finch had completed her closing routine as usual on Tuesday evening, the bowl would have been filled. If the bowl had not been filled, then either Mrs. Finch had been interrupted before she reached this table in her evening round, or something had occurred at this table after the routine had been completed. A person using sugar at this table, after the room had been cleared and the closing routine begun, would leave the bowl in precisely the condition Miss Marple was now observing. She sat down at the table and looked out at the garden, which was still and pale in the morning light, the lavender grey-green against the stone path. The wooden gate shut fast. Mrs. Cole appeared presently with a pot of tea and the information that the shortbread was just out of the oven, which she mentioned with a modest pride that was entirely justified when the shortbread arrived. Miss Marple thanked her, and, when the moment seemed agreeable, asked whether she had happened to look at the sugar bowl on this particular table when she was setting up on Thursday morning. Mrs. Cole paused in a way that indicated the question had arrived at a thought she had not previously examined. "I filled them all," she said slowly, "but I believe this one needed less than the others. I noticed it vaguely, in the way one does, without attaching any meaning to it." She looked at the bowl with an expression that was moving gradually from puzzlement towards something more uncomfortable. Sir Finch always filled them the evening before." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "that is what I had understood." "So if it was less than full on Thursday morning," said Mrs. Cole, arriving at the conclusion with the slight reluctance of someone who has not been looking forward to the destination, "then someone used it on Tuesday evening." "After the closing routine had been attended to," said Miss Marple gently. Mrs. Cole sat down in the chair opposite without being invited, which was a measure of how thoroughly the thought had displaced her usual social ease. "Someone was sitting at this table," she said, "after I'd gone home." Miss Marple poured her own tea and said nothing further on the subject immediately. There was, she had found, a certain value in allowing a mind to complete its own journey once it had been set upon the right road. Yet Mrs. Cole was a sensible woman, and sensible women often reach sound conclusions without requiring too much assistance, provided they were not hurried. The shortbread was, as advertised, excellent. After a little while, Miss Marple said, in a tone of simple curiosity, that she had been thinking about Miss Brooke's mention of the garden gate. "Lydia heard it just after dark," said Mrs. Cole, whose composure had largely reasserted itself. "She told Inspector Slack, though I'm not certain he thought it particularly relevant. He was rather more interested in whether Mrs. Finch had a history of dizzy spells, which she most certainly did not." "Miss Brooke's workroom window," said Miss Marple. "It faces the rear of the terrace, I think you said." "The back of her building does, yes. The footpath runs along behind all of us along this row." "Her window is above it," Mrs. Cole considered. "She would hear the gate quite clearly. It has a particular sound. The latch is slightly loose, and it gives a little rattle when it swings." "Did you happen to see Mr. Garner on Thursday?" Miss Marple asked, with the mild appearance of changing the subject. "He came in for his usual pot on Thursday afternoon," said Mrs. Cole. "He asked after things in a considerate way, and said that Mrs. Finch had always been very kind about saving him the corner table. He seemed genuinely sorry." She paused. "He mentioned that he had said good evening to Mr. Hale on his way out on Tuesday, just outside, on the pavement. He thought nothing of it at the time." Miss Marple set down her cup with the steady hand of a person who has just received a piece of information she had been expecting, and is careful not to receive it too visibly. "Mr. Hale was still outside the tea-room when Mr. Garner departed." "So it seems," said Mrs. Cole. She was looking at the table surface with a thoughtful expression. "Mr. Garner said he assumed Mr. Hale had forgotten something, and was about to go back in. He did not wait to see." Miss Marple looked once more at the half-filled sugar bowl, sitting in its customary place on the clean white cloth, perfectly ordinary and entirely out of keeping with the orderly habits of the woman who had set it there. Small habits she had always believed were among the most revealing things a person possessed. They were formed without calculation and maintained without effort, and when they were disrupted, the disruption generally had a cause, one that was, more often than not, to be found in the presence of another person. Someone had sat at this table, had used the sugar, and had passed through the garden gate after dark. And Mr. Bernard Hale, by Mr. Garner's unintentional testimony, had been standing on the pavement outside the Willow Corner tea room at the very moment the last regular customer of the evening departed. Miss Marple finished her shortbread, thanked Mrs. Cole warmly for the tea, and went out into the Friday morning to call upon Miss Lydia Brooke. Chapter 5. A Receipt Beneath the Counter Tray. Miss Lydia Brooke's workroom occupied the upper floor of a narrow Georgian house 3 doors along from the post office, reached by a side entrance and a staircase that creaked on the 3rd and 7th steps in a manner its owner had long since ceased to notice. A small brass plate beside the door read simply, L. Brooke, Dressmaking and Alterations, and below it, in smaller letters that had been added some years later, By Appointment Preferred. The addition of these last 2 words was, in Miss Marple's estimation, entirely characteristic of their author. She had sent a brief note around that morning, delivered by the boy from the post office, who performed such services for a modest and reliable consideration, and Miss Brooke had replied within the hour to say that she would be free from 11 o'clock, and that Miss Marple was welcome to come up. The workroom was a long, light space, with windows at both ends, the rear one looking out, as Mrs. Cole had indicated, over the footpath that ran behind the terrace. A long cutting table occupied the centre of the room, its surface marked by years of careful use, and along the walls were arranged bolts of fabric in various stages of consultation, some standing upright in a wooden rack, others folded and stacked on shelves with the neat precision of a person for whom disorder in the materials of work would be a form of professional discourtesy. 2 dress forms stood near the front window, one draped in a length of charcoal wool, the other bare. The room smelled pleasantly of fabric and the faint warm sweetness of a paraffin heater that had recently been turned off. Miss Brooke herself received Miss Marple with the composed cordiality of a woman who's genuinely glad to see a visitor, without feeling it necessary to make a production of the fact. She was dressed as usual, with a precision that stopped just short of severity. A grey skirt, a cream blouse with small pearl buttons, her dark hair drawn back without ornament. She cleared a pair of fabric scissors and a paper pattern from the chair by the rear window, and indicated that Miss Marple should sit, which Miss Marple did with the contented air of a person settling into a place that suits them. "You have come about the gate," said Miss Brooke, without preamble. "Partly," said Miss Marple, "and about other things that may or may not be connected to it." Miss Brooke poured tea from a small pot that had evidently been made in anticipation of the visit, which Miss Marple appreciated both practically and as evidence of Miss Brooke's particular variety of social thoughtfulness, the kind that expresses itself through preparation rather than effusion. "I told Inspector Slack what I heard," said Miss Brooke, settling into the chair on the other side of the cutting table with her own cup. "He was polite, but I could see he considered it of no great consequence. A gate closing in the evening is hardly remarkable, I suppose, unless one knows that it ought not to have been closing at all at that hour. What time was it, as precisely as you can recall?" Miss Brooke considered this with the seriousness it deserved, which was one of the things Miss Marple found most useful about her. There are people who, when asked about time, will offer an approximate figure with the confidence of certainty, and there are people who will genuinely attempt to reconstruct the sequence of their evening and arrive at an honest estimate. Miss Brooke was decidedly the latter. "I had finished a hem I was working on," she said, "and put on the kettle, which I usually do around 7:30. I believe it was after that, because I remember carrying my cup to the window while the tea was still hot, and looking out at the path because the light had nearly gone. I would say between 20 minutes and 8:30, with 20 minutes to 8 being my better guess." She paused. "It was not gradual, the gate rattling, I mean, in the way it does when the wind moves it. It was a single definite sound, the latch dropping into place. Someone had come through and closed it deliberately behind them." Miss Marple nodded and looked at the window through which the footpath was just visible. a narrow strip of grey stone running between the rear walls of the terrace buildings and a low hedge on the far side. Coming in or going out, do you think? Going out, said Miss Brooke without hesitation. The gate opens inward toward the tea-room garden. The latch sounds different depending on which way it swings. This was the sound of it being pulled shut from the outside. This was precisely the kind of detail that Inspector Slack's interviews tended not to produce, Miss Marple reflected, because the inspector did not as a rule ask the questions that would occasion it. "I ought also to mention," said Miss Brooke, setting down a cup with a small deliberate movement that suggested she had been deciding whether to raise the subject, "that I saw Mr. Hale that afternoon. Not at the tea-room, or not only there. I passed him on the high street at approximately 5:15, after I had been to collect some thread from the haberdashers. He was standing outside the bank, which was already closed for the day, and he looked, I would say he looked occupied, not in an active sense, more as though he were running something through his mind that he found disagreeable. Did you speak to him?" We nodded. He is an acquaintance, not a friend, and he appeared to have no particular wish to converse. I formed the impression that he was waiting for something, or working up to something. One sometimes gets that sense of a person. Miss Marple accepted a second cup of tea and thought, not for the first time, that Miss Lydia Brooke's precise and unsentimental intelligence had been considerably underestimated by those who mistook her reserve for limitation. It was shortly after she returned to her own cottage that Miss Marple learned of the receipt. Dolly Bantry telephoned in the early afternoon, as she not infrequently did when there was news, with the information that Inspector Slack had that morning made a more thorough examination of the tea-room counter and its vicinity, and had discovered, beneath the cash tray in the till drawer, a folded receipt that had apparently been overlooked in the initial inspection. The receipt recorded a payment of £2.10, made that Tuesday afternoon by a Mr. B. Hale, for what was noted on the counterfoil simply as goods received. The amount was modest and the description vague. "He seems to think it is perfectly ordinary," said Dolly, conveying Inspector Slack's position with the tone of one who found it interesting precisely because she was not certain she agreed. "A customer paying for his tea, nothing more." £2.10, said Miss Marple, is a considerable sum for a pot of tea and a slice of cake. There was a brief silence on the line. "I had not thought of that," said Dolly. Mrs. Cole, when Miss Marple telephoned her shortly afterward on the pretext of inquiring whether the establishment would be open Saturday, mentioned, in the course of a conversation that wandered comfortably through several related topics, that Mr. Hale's visit that Tuesday had not been entirely typical. He had been, she said, rather less easy in his manner than usual. She had remarked upon it to Mrs. Finch in the kitchen afterward, though she had not thought it worth raising with Inspector Slack, not wishing to seem as though she were making something out of nothing. "He and Mrs. Finch spoke together near the back door," she added. "I did not hear what was said. I was at the counter and they spoke quietly. But it was not the usual sort of conversation. How's trade, and isn't the weather fine? It was something more particular." Miss Marple thanked her and rang off and sat for some time in her armchair, with her knitting in her lap, the needles still. Mr. Hale had made an unusually large payment that afternoon. He had been observed by Mr. Garner still standing outside the tea-room when the last customer left. He had been seen by Miss Brooke on the high street beforehand, in a state that she had described, with characteristic precision, as a person working up to something. And someone had come through the garden gate and pulled it carefully shut behind them, going out at 20 minutes to 8 on a Tuesday evening. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their quiet rhythm. She had, she thought, a tolerably clear picture of the shape of things. What remained were the finer details, and the confirmation of one or two points that she did not yet feel she could state with certainty. That stage of an inquiry was always, in its way, the most absorbing, the point at which the general outline had resolved itself, and what remained was to fill it in with sufficient particularity to be sure of what one had seen. She would, she decided, speak with Mr. Hale, not yet, but soon. Chapter 6. Porcelain cup on the stone floor. Saturday arrived in the manner of a guest who has dressed carefully for an occasion, and finds, upon arrival, that the occasion has shifted in mood since the invitation was issued. The morning was bright and cool, with that particular crystalline quality of late August light that flatters everything it falls upon. The stone walls, the cottage gardens, the distant line of the downs, while carrying in its air the first unambiguous suggestion that September was not very far away. It was the sort of morning that under ordinary circumstances would have encouraged a pleasant walk and perhaps a longer stay than usual at the Willow Corner, over a pot of something warming. The circumstances, however, were not ordinary, and St. Mary Mead knew it. There was still a certain watchfulness in the village, a quality of attention directed inward at itself, as communities sometimes exhibit when an event has occurred that cannot yet be fully categorized. Not alarm precisely, and not grief alone, but a kind of unresolved collective question that had not yet received a satisfying answer. Inspector Slack had indicated to at least 2 people, who had naturally indicated it to several more, that the matter was substantially settled in his mind, and that the formalities were largely administrative at this stage. This view was received in the village with the particular species of polite scepticism that is extended to authority figures who are felt to be closing a door a little prematurely. Miss Marple, for her part, had risen early and spent a profitable hour in her garden before the dew had fully lifted, which gave her time to think without the distraction of other obligations. She had formed the habit, over many years, of allowing her more active reflections to arrange themselves while her hands were occupied with something practical, and the combination of secateurs and a well-stocked herbaceous border had served her extremely well in this regard. By 10 o'clock she was at the tea-room. It was Mrs. Cole who raised the matter of the cup. She did so not because she had been planning to. It came out in the course of a conversation about the rear kitchen, which Miss Marple had asked to look at under the straightforward pretext of admiring the tile work, which was genuinely admirable. Mrs. Cole had come through to point out a particularly fine panel of Delft blue tiles above the range, and in doing so had moved to one side, and her eye had gone almost involuntarily to the space beneath the lowest kitchen shelf, nearest the door to the back garden. It was there, she said, under that shelf, when I came in on Wednesday morning, before anyone else had arrived. I almost stepped on it before I saw it. The porcelain cup, said Miss Marple. Yes. Mrs. Cole bent and indicated the place, a low, shadowed recess where the shelf met the wall, the sort of spot into which a small, round object might roll and lie undisturbed. I had washed all the cups before I went home on Tuesday. I was quite sure of it. I do them in order, the cups first, then the saucers, then the small plates. It is the same every evening, and I do not vary it. There was not a single cup left out when I went home. You told Inspector Slack. I mentioned it. He seemed to feel it was not a matter of much significance. Mrs. Cole's expression conveyed, with considerable economy, what she thought of this assessment. He suggested it might have been a cup I had missed, or one that had been left on a shelf rather than put away properly and had fallen in the night. Shelves, said Miss Marple, examining the one in question, which was level, solid, and firmly attached to the wall, do not generally produce falling cups on their own initiative. No, said Mrs. Cole, they do not. Miss Marple crouched, with the deliberate care of a woman who has learned that her joints hold firm opinions about rapid movement, and examined the stone floor beneath the shelf. The surface was clean now, having been swept and washed on Thursday morning, but the proximity of the cup's resting place to the garden door was, in itself, informative. The door was no more than 4 feet away. A cup dropped at or near the door could quite easily roll to precisely this spot. You said it had a mark on the rim, said Miss Marple, straightening. A small chip and a dark line where it had struck the floor. The cup itself was otherwise undamaged. Mrs. Cole paused. I kept it. I did not feel I ought to throw it away, though I cannot exactly say why. I am glad you did not. Mrs. Cole produced the cup from the back of the higher shelf, where she had placed it out of the general rotation, wrapped in a square of cloth. It was a modest piece, cream-coloured with the same blue rim that distinguished the tea-room service, of no particular value beyond its function. The mark on the rim was as Mrs. Cole had described, a clean chip and a fine dark line extending perhaps half an inch along the porcelain, of the kind produced by a sharp, sudden impact with a hard surface. Someone had dropped this cup. They had dropped it near the garden door, and it had rolled under the shelf, and they had either not noticed or not stopped to retrieve it. In Miss Marple's experience, a person who drops something and does not stop to pick it up is generally a person whose attention has been very forcibly directed elsewhere. She turned the cup in her hands for a moment and then set it gently on the kitchen table. "Mrs. Cole," she said, "when you and Mrs. Finch had your end-of-day conversation at the counter on Tuesday, the one you mentioned when she told you she would see you Thursday, did she seem to you entirely at ease?" Mrs. Cole was quiet for a moment. It was not the quietness of a person who did not know the answer, but of one who was deciding how honestly to give it. "She was settled," she said at last. "Not exactly at ease. There is a difference, I think, between a person who is comfortable and a person who has decided to be composed. She was the latter, I believe, that evening. I noticed it at the time, but thought nothing very particular of it. Mrs. Finch was not a woman who showed her concerns readily." "No," said Miss Marple, "she was not." She thanked Mrs. Cole for the tea, declined a slice of the walnut cake on this occasion, and went out through the front room rather than the kitchen, pausing as she passed the table by the garden door. The sugar bowl sat in its place, freshly filled. The late morning light fell across the table at a low angle, illuminating the clean cloth and the small ordinary objects arranged upon it with an almost deliberate clarity, as though the room itself were making a point. A cup dropped suddenly. A door that was always bolted left open. A woman described as composed rather than comfortable on the last evening of her life. These were not the elements of an accidental death, arranged with the casual disorder of misfortune. They were, rather, the residue of a scene that had been subsequently attended to, imperfectly and in some haste, by someone who had understood the need for concealment, but had not had either the time or the steadiness of mind to achieve it thoroughly. The cup had been missed because it had rolled out of sight. The garden door had been bolted after, but not, Miss Marple suspected, by Mrs. Finch. The table had been partially cleared, but not completely. The coins at the till had been left as they fell. Each omission was consistent with a single explanation, that the person responsible for tidying had been operating under considerable emotional distress and with an awareness of time pressing upon them from without. Miss Marple walked home along the high street in the bright, deceptive Saturday morning, nodding to Mrs. Hartley outside the church and to the postman on his second round, and thought about the human capacity for panic. It was, she had observed over a long life, not so much a loss of intelligence as a narrowing of it, the mind contracting around the immediate and urgent at the expense of the peripheral, which was precisely where, in her experience, the most revealing things tended to be. She would speak with Mr. and hail on Monday. She had, she believed, sufficient clarity now to know what questions to ask. Chapter 7. Coins scattered by the till-drawer. Sunday in St. Mary Mead carried its own distinct character, quite unlike any other day of the week. The morning belonged to the church, and those who attended did so with the comfortable regularity of long habit, exchanging greetings on the path outside with the unhurried warmth of people who see one another often enough not to require ceremony, but value the occasion none the less. The afternoon, by general and unspoken agreement, belonged to the garden or to the armchair, or to whatever private occupation a person had been deferring since Monday. And the evening settled over the village with the particular quietness of a community that has, for one day at least, agreed to leave things largely as they are. Miss Marple attended the morning service and found it, as she generally did, both spiritually sustaining and socially instructive. The distribution of the congregation told one a great deal, if one was paying attention, who sat with whom, who arrived together, who chose a pew that placed them at a certain distance from another. On this particular Sunday she noticed that Mr. Thomas Garner occupied his customary place in the third row with the composed solitude of a man at peace with his own company, and that Miss Lydia Brooke sat 2 rows behind and to the left, her attention directed forward with characteristic steadiness. Mrs. Cole was not present, which was unusual, and suggested to Miss Marple that the demands of keeping the tea-room in proper order through a week of considerable strain had perhaps caught up with her. Of Mr. Bernard Hale there was naturally no sign. He was not a resident of St. Mary Mead, and his visits were governed by the requirements of his trade rather than the rhythms of village life. It was after the service, while exchanging a few pleasant words with the vicar's wife near the Lich Gate, that Miss Marple heard something that altered her Sunday afternoon considerably. The information arrived, as useful information so often does, embedded within a conversation that was ostensibly about something else entirely. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, was a kind and moderately perceptive woman who had lived in the village long enough to absorb its patterns, without always being entirely aware that she had done so. She was speaking of the tea-room with genuine warmth. She had been fond of Mrs. Finch, and said so without embarrassment, when she mentioned, almost incidentally, that her husband had encountered Inspector Slack on Saturday afternoon, and that the inspector had seemed in rather better spirits than the occasion warranted, having apparently satisfied himself on what he called the remaining administrative points. "He said something to Gerald about the till," said Mrs. Clement, adjusting her gloves against the morning chill. "Some coins that had fallen out. He seemed to feel it confirmed his view of things, that she had been counting the takings when she was taken ill. Gerald said he seemed quite settled on the matter." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "I'd heard something of the sort." She walked home rather more thoughtfully than she had walked to church. The coins at the till had been discussed briefly in the early accounts. Mrs. Cole had mentioned them, and the inspector had fastened upon them as corroborating his preferred sequence of events. A woman counting the day's takings, a sudden collapse, the coins falling as she went. It was a coherent enough picture, and Miss Marple did not dispute that it might describe what had happened so far as it went. Her objection was not to the picture itself, but to a detail within it that did not quite accord with what she knew of the habits of the woman it purported to depict. She made herself a light luncheon and sat afterward in her garden, which was at its most forgiving in this soft September-adjacent light, the dahlias leaning gently and the last of the sweet peas drifting in the slight breeze, and she thought about the coins. Mrs. Finch counted the day's takings each evening. That much was established and consistent. She was a careful woman with money, careful in the way of those who have managed alone and know precisely what it cost to do so. Her accounts, Mrs. Cole had mentioned in passing, were always exact. She kept a small leather notebook in the till drawer in which she recorded each day's total in a firm, regular hand, and she cross-referenced it with the receipts at the end of each week with the methodical thoroughness of someone who found the exercise, if not exactly pleasurable, at least satisfying in the way that completed tasks are satisfying. Miss Marple had asked Mrs. Cole on Saturday whether the leather notebook had been examined. Mrs. Cole had looked at her with a slightly startled expression and said that she did not believe anyone had thought to look at it particularly. Miss Marple had suggested, with the gentlest possible emphasis, that it might be worth locating. She had received a telephone call on Saturday evening. Mrs. Cole's voice had been careful and precise, and more than a little troubled. The notebook, she said, had been found in its usual place in the till drawer. Tuesday's entry was incomplete. The figures recorded stopped partway through the day's total, in the middle of a column addition, and the pen had left a small trailing mark at the point where it had been set down, or, more accurately, at the point where it had been dropped. The entry had not been finished. The day's total had never been entered. A woman of Mrs. Finch's habits did not leave her accounts unfinished. She did not set her pen down in the middle of a column. She did not, for that matter, allow coins to remain scattered on a counter after the till had been opened and attended to. If she had been counting takings and had been taken suddenly ill, the coins might have fallen, but she would not, at any earlier stage of the process, have left her figures incomplete in the notebook. The sequence, as Miss Marple reconstructed it, was rather different from Inspector Slack's. Mrs. Finch had begun her closing routine in the correct order. She had cleared the tables, all but one which had been used subsequently. She had washed the cups, she had refilled the sugar bowls. She had then come to the till to begin counting the day's takings. She had opened the notebook. She had made a beginning on the column. At this point something had interrupted her. Not illness, an arrival. Someone had come and the routine had stopped. And the notebook had been left open with its unfinished column, and the cup had been dropped near the garden door, and the door itself had been left unbolted, and the coins had been scattered from the till in a manner that was not consistent with a person going carefully through the day's earnings, but was entirely consistent with a drawer being pulled open or closed with some agitation and then imperfectly attended to afterward. Miss Marple sat with these thoughts arranged before her until the afternoon light had shifted and the garden had taken on the long shadows of early evening. Then she went indoors and wrote a brief note to Inspector Slack, requesting that he give her a short time on Monday morning, as she had one or two observations she felt he might find useful in concluding the matter to everyone's satisfaction. She worded it, or as she always worded such communications to the inspector, with scrupulous modesty. The rather helpless modesty of a very elderly lady who has noticed one or two small things and wonders if they might be of any interest to a person with proper authority and trained professional judgment. She had found, over many years, that this approach produced better results than any alternative, and she employed it without the slightest sense of dishonesty, since it contained not a single statement that was technically untrue. The inspector, she was fairly confident, would come. She also, after a pause, wrote a second note, not to the inspector but to Mr. Bernard Hale, addressed to the commercial boarding house near the market town where she had established, through the efficient machinery of village knowledge, that he kept a room on his weekly circuit. The note was brief and did not explain itself in any particular detail. It said only that Miss Marple would be in St. Mary Mead on Monday, and would be grateful for a short conversation if Mr. Hale found himself in the vicinity, as she believed there was a matter he might find it a relief to discuss. She sealed both envelopes and set them on the hall table for the Monday post, and then returned to her armchair and her knitting, and spent the remainder of the quiet Sunday evening in that state of settled concentration which to anyone observing her from outside would have appeared to be simple restfulness. It was, in its way, precisely that. The coins had told her the last thing she needed to know. What remained now was the human part, which was always, in Miss Marple's experience, both the most delicate and the most important. Chapter 8, A Guest Who Returned After Closing. Monday arrived with thin cloud and a light wind that moved through the village with the purposeful air of something that had somewhere else to be. The roses along the lane had dropped another tier of petals overnight, and the gutters were edged in pale pink, in a way that was rather pretty in the morning light, though it confirmed, as if confirmation were needed, that summer had made its decision and was acting upon it. Miss Marple had her breakfast early and was dressed by 8:30 in the navy blue coat she wore for occasions that required a degree of what she privately thought of as moral readiness. Not formality exactly, but a certain composure of appearance that expressed composure of mind. Either she had learned long ago that the way one presented oneself to a difficult conversation had a measurable effect upon how the conversation proceeded, and she saw no reason to be indifferent to such practical advantages. Inspector Slack arrived at 9:05, as she had expected he would. He was a punctual man, whatever else might be said of him, and he had the professional's instinct for not leaving elderly ladies' notes unacknowledged, since experience had taught him that elderly ladies who wrote notes tended to be persistent in their follow-up. He accepted a cup of tea with the air of a man performing a social obligation he expects to discharge quickly, and settled into the armchair across from Miss Marple with a courteous but slightly guarded expression. Miss Marple did not keep him waiting. She laid out what she had established, in the measured and sequential manner she had been organising in her mind since Saturday evening, moving from the sugar bowl to the notebook to the cup to the coins, connecting each detail to the others with the patient logic of a person, assembling something that had always had a coherent form, even when its components were scattered. She did not tell the inspector what conclusion to draw. She simply arranged the evidence before him, as one might arrange objects on a table for another person's inspection, taking care that the arrangement itself made the relationships clear. Inspector Slack, to his considerable credit, listened with more attention than she had quite anticipated. He was a man whose pride sometimes closed him to suggestion, but he was also, beneath the professional confidence, genuinely conscientious. And the unfinished notebook entry in particular appeared to reach him where the other details had not. He asked 2 questions, both sensible. He turned his teacup in its saucer for a moment in a way that suggested internal revision. And then he said, with the careful neutrality of a man adjusting his position without entirely admitting that he had previously occupied a different one, that he thought it would be worth having another conversation with Mr. Hale before drawing any final conclusions. "He's in the village today, I believe," said Miss Marple pleasantly. The inspector's expression suggested that he found this less surprising than he might have wished to. "You've written to him?" "I suggested he might find it useful to speak with someone," said Miss Marple. "I was not more specific than that." After the inspector had gone, Miss Marple sat for a short while with her second cup of tea and the quiet satisfaction of a person who has accomplished a necessary thing in a reasonable manner. Then she put on her coat and went out. It was Miss Lydia Brooke who provided the piece that completed the morning's picture, though she did so entirely without intention, and, as far as Miss Marple could judge, without any awareness that what she was saying was of particular significance. Miss Marple encountered her on the high street at 10:30, coming out of the draper's with a paper parcel of some neatly chosen fabric, and they fell into step together in the way of 2 people whose pace happens to agree. Miss Brooke mentioned, after a few preliminary remarks about the morning and the turn in the weather, that she'd been meaning to raise something she had remembered since their conversation on Friday. It had occurred to her only gradually, she said, in the way that things sometimes do when one has been asked a question, and the mind continues to work on it after the conversation has ended. On the Tuesday evening in question, she had been standing at her workroom window when she heard the garden gate, as she had described, but she now remembered, with the growing clarity of a recollection properly attended to, that she had also seen, some time before the gate sounded, she thought perhaps 40 minutes before, while there was still a remnant of evening light, the figure of a man on the footpath. He had been walking away from the tea-room in the direction of the main road, at a pace that she had registered at the time as slightly hurried without finding it remarkable. "I could not identify him with certainty at that distance and in that light," she said, with the scrupulous honesty that characterized everything she said. "But he was a broad-shouldered man in a dark coat, and he was carrying a briefcase or bag of some kind. I thought nothing of it at the time, as the footpath is a public right-of-way. But in view of everything, I felt you ought to know." "Thank you," said Miss Marple. "That is very helpful indeed." She parted from Miss Brooke at the corner of the High Street and walked on, fitting this new detail into the sequence she had already constructed. The figure seen on the path before the gate sounded. Then, some 40 minutes later, the gate itself being pulled shut from outside. A man who had left by the front of the building would have no reason to return via the back footpath, unless he had re-entered the building through the garden, conducted whatever business he had come to conduct, and then left again by the same route he had come, in and out by the garden, inconspicuous, deliberate. She was turning into the lane that led back toward her cottage when she encountered Mr. Bernard Hale. He was standing near the pillar box at the lane's entrance with the uncertain posture of a man who has arrived somewhere and is not entirely sure he should have done. He was wearing a good dark coat and carrying his briefcase, which Miss Marple noted with a calm inward acknowledgment, and his complexion, always rather florid, as had taken on an additional quality that she recognized as the physical expression of prolonged anxiety. He was not a young man in poor health. He was a healthy man who had not slept well for several days. He raised his hat when he saw her, and there was in the gesture a relief that he evidently had not anticipated feeling. "Miss Marple," he said, "I received your note." "I'm glad," she said. "Shall we walk a little? The lane is pleasant at this hour." They walked. Miss Marple did not immediately speak, and Mr. Hale, after 1 or 2 preliminary efforts at an ordinary tone that did not quite take hold, fell silent also. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was rather the silence of a conversation that has not yet found its proper beginning, and Miss Marple allowed it to continue until they had turned the corner and were following the lane beside the churchyard wall, where the old yews gave a sense of enclosure that was, for certain conversations, rather conducive. "I expect," said Miss Marple at last, in a tone of such mild and undramatic kindness that the words themselves became secondary to the manner of their delivery, "that it has been a very difficult week." Mr. Hale let out a breath that seemed to have been held for considerably longer than a week. "You know, then, I know a sufficient number of things," said Miss Marple, "and I believe Inspector Slack is arriving at one or two more in his own way, which is usually a reliable way, given a little time and the right arrangement of the facts." She paused. "He is a good man, the inspector, within his limitations. He prefers to reach his conclusions honestly, when they are placed where he can see them." Mr. Hale stopped walking. He was looking at the churchyard wall with the expression of a man who is deciding, not whether to speak, but how to begin. Miss Marple waited, her hands folded comfortably on her basket handle, her expression attentive and entirely without judgment. "I never intended," he began, and then stopped. "No," said Miss Marple gently. "I did not suppose for a moment that you did." He looked at her then, with a directness that was partly surprise and partly, she thought, the particular gratitude of a person who has been dreading condemnation and finds instead a quality of plain human understanding. He was not, she had decided some days ago, a bad man. He was a frightened one, which is a different thing entirely, and which calls for a different kind of response. "Miss Brooke," he said, after a moment, "saw me on the path. She mentioned it this morning." He absorbed this with a small, accepting nod, as though it confirmed what he had already privately concluded, that the careful arrangement he had attempted on Tuesday evening had been insufficient, and that its insufficiency had been, in some manner, inevitable. "I went back," he said. "After I left the front, I went round by the path." He paused. "I had forgotten my umbrella." Miss Marple said nothing. Mr. Hale looked at the wall again. "Except that I hadn't," he said quietly. "Mrs. Cole will have told you that as well, I suppose." "She mentioned," said Miss Marple, "that no umbrella had been found." He nodded once more, slowly, and they stood for a moment in the shelter of the yew trees while the light wind moved through the lane, and the village went about its Monday morning around them, at a comfortable and sufficient distance. "Embarrassment," Miss Marple said at last very gently, "often arises from something rather smaller than guilt, though the two can become confused when a person has been alone with a thing for too long." Mr. Hale turned to look at her, and she thought that whatever he had been carrying since Tuesday evening had, in this moment, become marginally less entirely his alone to bear. "Inspector Slack," she said, "is, I believe, a reasonable man when spoken to plainly. I think you will find it a considerable relief." They walked back toward the High Street in a quietness that was, Miss Marple thought, of a rather different quality than the one with which they had set out. Chapter 9. The quiet arrangement of an evening. Inspector Slack arrived at the Willow Corner tea room at 2:30 on Monday afternoon. Miss Marple knew this not because she had been watching for him. She had been sitting quite properly at her usual table near the fireplace with a pot of Darjeeling and a piece of Mrs. Cole's ginger cake, but because Mrs. Cole came through from the back room with an expression of carefully maintained composure that told her everything she needed to know before a word had been exchanged. "The inspector is here," said Mrs. Cole, in a tone that managed to be both informative and interrogative simultaneously. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I thought he might be." She did not follow them into the back office, nor would it have occurred to her to do so. There are moments in the course of human events that require a certain privacy, not merely for legal or practical reasons, but for the deeper reason that some reckonings, when they finally arrive, are better conducted without an audience. She remained at her table and attended to her cake, and looked out at the garden through the glass, where the late afternoon light was doing something rather fine with the stone path and the last of the lavender. She heard nothing. The back office was well removed from the main room and its door was closed. The tea room was quiet at this hour, the luncheon trade having departed and the afternoon visitors not yet arrived in any number. A woman Miss Marple did not know came in, ordered a pot of tea from the girl Mrs. Cole had engaged for the afternoons, and sat reading a magazine with the contentment of someone who was nowhere particular to be. Miss Marple refilled her cup and waited, which she was very good at. It was nearly 4 o'clock when Inspector Slack reappeared. He came through the main room with the measured tread of a man who has conducted a significant interview and is organising its contents as he walks. He paused at Miss Marple's table and looked at her for a moment in a way that combined professional reserve with something that might, in a less self-conscious person, have been acknowledged as gratitude. "I should like to understand," he said, pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down without being invited, which Miss Marple took as a compliment of sorts, "how you arrived at it." "Shall I tell you from the beginning?" she said. "If you would." She set down her cup and folded her hands on the table in the manner of someone who's about to explain something they have given considerable thought and intend to explain clearly. "It had begun," she said, "with the door. Not because an unbolted door was in itself remarkable, but because it was inconsistent with a woman whose habits were settled and whose establishment was run on the principle that settled habits were a form of courtesy to the people who depended on them. When a reliable person departs from a reliable habit, the departure requires an explanation. Inspector Slack had supplied one. Illness, accident, an ordinary episode of misfortune. Miss Marple had found this explanation wanting not on emotional grounds but on practical ones, because it accounted for the door without accounting for everything else that was wrong with the room. The sugar bowl had been half empty, where Mrs. Finch's custom was to fill it each evening. The notebook entry was incomplete, abandoned mid-column in a manner entirely foreign to a woman who found comfort in finished things. The cup had been dropped near the garden door and left where it fell, which was inconsistent both with Mrs. Finch's tidiness and with Mrs. Cole's confirmed memory of having washed the complete service before departing. The coins had scattered from the till in a manner that suggested not the gradual disorganisation of a woman taken ill, but the sharper disorder of an interrupted moment. Taken singly, each of these might have accommodated the inspector's preferred account. Taken together, they described not an evening that had gone wrong in one place, but an evening that had been subsequently rearranged, imperfectly, because the person rearranging it had been working quickly and under considerable distress, and because the small, habitual details of another person's life are very difficult to replicate convincingly from the outside. Mr. Hale had returned to the tea-room after the close of business. He had done so through the garden, entering by the rear gate while it was still light enough to see his way, which accounted for his presence on the footpath as observed by Miss Brooke. He had used the sugar at the table nearest the garden door, the most natural table to occupy if one had come in from the garden, and was sitting, as it were, just inside the room, conducting a conversation one wished to conclude quickly. He had been there when the cup was dropped, or had dropped it himself in the agitation of the moment and had not retrieved it. He had been present, or had been present very shortly before, when the coins were scattered from the till, possibly when Mrs. Finch opened it to address the question of the debt she was owed, or possibly in the subsequent confusion. The conversation had become heated. Mrs. Finch, who was a composed woman rather than an easy one, had said something that Mr. Hale had found intolerable, not because it was cruel, but because it was true and because he was afraid of it. She had stumbled in the argument. She had fallen against the stone threshold of the garden door, which was raised slightly above the kitchen floor level, and the fall had been the kind that a person of her age, in that precise circumstance, does not recover from. Mr. Hale had not run. That was the detail Miss Marple found in its way, the most human and the most revealing. A wholly calculating person would have gone immediately and invented the umbrella story at once from a position of cold composure. Instead, he had stayed long enough to attempt a tidying of the scene, closing the garden door, gathering what he could see that was out of place, trying to restore the appearance of an ordinary evening. He had done this badly because he was not a tidy criminal but a frightened man, and because the room belonged to someone else, and he did not know it well enough to know what he had missed. He had then left by the garden gate, pulling it shut behind him, and Miss Brooke had heard it close at 20 minutes to 8. Inspector Slack listened to all of this without interruption, which was, Miss Marple thought, the best compliment he was capable of paying. When she'd finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the table surface. "The debt," he said. "A small one, I believe. A private matter of credit between them, of the sort that sometimes develops between a travelling salesman and a proprietress who extends accommodations to a valued regular customer over time. The kind of arrangement that is perfectly manageable when all parties are comfortable, but which becomes awkward when circumstances change, or when one party requires resolution and the other is not prepared to provide it." Miss Marple paused. Mrs. Finch, I think, had asked for settlement. Mr. Hale feared she would speak of it to others in a way that might affect his professional reputation. He came back to persuade her otherwise. His persuasion became, in a moment of mutual frustration, rather more emphatic than he had intended. "He has told me substantially the same thing," said Inspector Slack. He paused. "Not in those words." "No," said Miss Marple, "I imagine not." The inspector rose, straightened his coat, and stood for a moment with a slightly searching expression. "I don't suppose," he said, with the carefully offhand manner of a man who is asking something he will deny, having asked if the occasion demands it, "that you have any thoughts on how these things are best handled, given the circumstances." Miss Marple considered him for a moment with the mild, clear gaze that she'd been told, on more than one occasion. Mariska was rather disconcerting. "I think," she said, "that Mr. Hale is not a violent man, and that he has known that since Tuesday evening and found it a very heavy thing to carry alone. I think the facts speak plainly enough, and that the law is quite adequate to the situation without requiring anyone to be made into something they are not." She paused. "He will, I believe, be a great deal easier in himself once the matter is out of his own hands." Inspector Slack nodded once, in the brief, conclusive manner of a man filing a thought for later use, and said good afternoon, and went. Miss Marple looked out at the garden for a long moment. The light was going, the stone path fading to grey, the wooden gate still and latched. "People may arrange furniture and cups quite carefully," she said to herself very quietly. But human nature is rather more difficult to tidy." She gathered her basket, left a suitable sum on the table, and nodded pleasantly to Mrs. Cole, who was standing in the doorway to the back room with an expression that suggested the afternoon had been, in its way, a considerable relief. Outside, the early evening was settling over St. Mary Mead with its customary gentleness, and Miss Marple walked home through it, feeling, on the whole, that the world remained, despite its occasional inconveniences, a place in which things could generally be brought to a reasonable order. Chapter 10. Afternoon, light through the tea-room window. Several weeks passed before the Willow Corner tea-room could be said to have truly recovered its former character, and the recovery, when it came, was of the gradual and unannounced kind that is rather more persuasive than any deliberate effort at restoration could have been. September moved through the village at its customary measured pace, bringing with it the smell of bonfires and the first serious intention of autumn, and the tea-room opened each morning as it always had, and the villagers came in ones and twos as they always had, and Mrs. Harriet Cole presided over the counter with a quiet competence that had always been present in her, and had simply, until now, been expressed in a supporting role. She had taken on the management without any great announcement. There had been a conversation with Mrs. Finch's solicitor, and an arrangement reached with the estate, and a notice placed in the window for a fortnight that had since been removed, and after that the matter was, to all external appearances, settled. Mrs. Cole had engaged a young woman from the village to help on busy mornings, and had retained the girl for afternoon hours, and had altered very little else. The menu remained substantially as it had been. The tables were set in the same positions. The china, including the cup Mrs. Cole had preserved on the high shelf, which had now been quietly retired from service, and placed in the small corner cabinet that Mrs. Finch had kept for decorative pieces, remained the same cream and blue service it had always been. The change was one of atmosphere rather than arrangement. And it was a change so gradual that most people were not conscious of having noticed it until they found themselves thinking, one afternoon in late September, that the place felt rather itself again. Mr. Bernard Hale had spoken to Inspector Slack on the Monday afternoon, after Miss Marple's conversation with him by the churchyard wall. He had done so, by all accounts, with a plainness and a completeness that the inspector had found, if not exactly welcome, then at least professionally satisfying. The matter had proceeded through its necessary stages with the sober efficiency of a system that has, for all its imperfections, the considerable virtue of existing. It had been determined that the incident was not premeditated, that the circumstances were consistent with an argument that had gone tragically and unintendedly wrong, and that Mr. Hale, whatever his subsequent errors of judgment in the matter of the room's arrangement, had not set out on that Tuesday evening with any harmful purpose. These determinations did not, of course, render the outcome any less final for Mrs. Finch, but they shaped what followed in ways that the law considered material, and the village, on the whole, considered fair. Miss Marple had not attended any of the formal proceedings. She had not been asked to, and she would not have gone if she had been. Her part in the matter was, in her own estimation, a private one, the kind of contribution that is made not through institutions but through the quieter human mechanisms of attention and honesty and the willingness to say, plainly and without performance, what one has observed. She had said what needed to be said to the people who needed to hear it, and the rest had followed in its own proper order. It was on a Wednesday in the second week of October, when the first genuinely cold snap had sharpened the air, and the chestnut trees along the far lane were beginning their annual negotiation with gravity, that Dolly Bantry suggested an afternoon at the Willow Corner. They went at 3:30, when the light was already beginning to angle low through the front windows in that particular October way that makes the interior of any warm room appear especially inviting by contrast with the world outside. The tea-room held 3 other customers when they arrived. Mr. Garner in his customary corner, absorbed in his crossword with the steadfast devotion of a man who has found his vocation, and 2 women from the newer houses on the east side of the village, whose names Miss Marple had recently acquired. Mrs. Cole greeted them with the warm, unpresumptuous welcome she had apparently inherited from her predecessor, along with the responsibilities of management, which was, Miss Marple thought, the most natural form of tribute available to her. They settled at the window table, not the one by the garden door, but the front window, where the afternoon light fell across the white cloth in long pale oblongs, and the high street was visible in its October-composed entirety. Mrs. Cole brought tea and a plate of shortbread, and a small cake decorated with crystallized violets that she said she had been experimenting with, and that she hoped was acceptable, though her manner conveyed that she had reasonable confidence in it. It was acceptable. It was, in fact, very good. "Well," said Dolly Bantry, when they had been settled for some minutes and had exchanged the usual preliminary remarks about the weather and the shortbread, "I suppose it was rather more complicated than it looked." "Most things are," said Miss Marple, "and rather fewer things than we suppose are complicated in the ways we initially imagine." Dolly considered this. "Was there a moment when you were quite certain?" "The notebook," said Miss Marple, without hesitation. "When Mrs. Cole told me the column was unfinished and the pen had left a trailing mark, I was quite certain. A woman like Mrs. Finch does not leave a column unfinished. She completes the thing before she does anything else. If the column was abandoned, something interrupted her, not illness, which announces itself gradually and allows a person to set a pen down properly, but an interruption of the sudden external kind." She paused. Everything before that had pointed in the same direction, but the notebook was where the pointing became conclusive. "And Mr. Hale," said Dolly, in a tone that was not quite a question. "Mr. Hale," said Miss Marple, "is a man who made a serious error of judgment, and who then made a second one in trying to conceal the first, and who has, I believe, been more genuinely altered by the experience than a good many people who pass through similar circumstances emerge. Whether that is sufficient is not, I think, for me to determine." Dolly nodded and poured more tea and looked out at the high street with the expression of a woman who has found the conclusion satisfying if not entirely cheerful, which was, Miss Marple felt, the appropriate response. The afternoon continued in its pleasant, unhurried way. Mr. Garner completed something in his crossword that appeared to give him quiet satisfaction. The two women near the back exchanged opinions on a topic that was too low-voiced to identify, but that produced periodic expressions of interested agreement. The light moved by degrees across the white tablecloth, narrowing and warming as it went. At some point Mrs. Cole came to collect the teapot and ask whether they would take anything further, and Dolly, who had been watching the room with the comfortable attention of a person at leisure in agreeable surroundings, said that she thought the place had come back to itself rather well. "I think so," said Mrs. Cole. She said it without excessive modesty or false diminishment, which suggested to Miss Marple that she had thought about it and arrived at the same conclusion herself. "Mrs. Finch made something worth continuing. That is the best thing I can say of it, and of her." It was, Miss Marple thought, exactly the right thing to say, and said in exactly the right way. After Mrs. Cole had gone, Dolly asked whether the mystery had been particularly complicated, in the retrospective tone of one settling an overall impression. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, turning her cup slightly in its saucer in the way she did when she was choosing her words with some care. "The tea-room simply revealed what tea-rooms always reveal," she said. Dolly waited. People behave naturally when they believe they are comfortable. Miss Marple looked out at the high street, where the afternoon had deepened to that particular October amber that lends even the most familiar street a quality of mild illumination. And in comfort, one learns far more about character than in crisis. A crisis puts people on their guard. Comfort makes them forget to be. She stirred her cup thoughtfully, and the small sound of the spoon